All right, good afternoon, Valencia students, and welcome to our lecture number 12 on the development and the early days of the Roman Republic. Today we'll look at some intriguing elements of how ideas of political representation were brought forward in the experience of the Roman Republic, and then we will look as the Roman Republic starts expanding out its power within the Italian peninsula as well as around the Mediterranean world, how this unique experiment in a republican style of government will be transformed into one of the mightiest empires the world had ever known. Where did this come from, and how did it impact other peoples, particularly in themes of repression throughout the Roman Empire? So what is Rome? And the answer to that is highly complicated. At first, Rome will simply be a city, and Rome still to this day exists as a city. It is the capital city of the modern European nation of Italy. Italy is defined by the geographic boundaries of the Italian peninsula, jettisoning out into the Mediterranean Sea. But Rome was not always just a city. Rome was known as a republic. Rome was known as an empire. And when young people are asked, what are you interested in history? If they're asked about modern history, they usually say, I'm interested in Nazis, World War II, blah, 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 blah. If they're asked about ancient history, almost exclusively, young people will say, I want to know about the Greeks, I want to know about the Romans, because they have intriguing elements of mythology that overlap. They have very similar structures when it comes down to their society, when it comes down to their culture. And the Greek and the Roman cultures and political structures are what came forward in modern times and helped to build republics such as the United States. So it's highly important to know something about Rome, but since this is a survey course, we can only go through just a small portion. So if we talk about the Italian peninsula, archaeologists state that most of the settlements that they start finding first discoveries of are around the year 2000 BCE. Many of the people who were first settled in these territories were nomadic peoples who had crossed the Alps. They had come down into the Italian peninsula, and they recognized that the soil was incredibly rich, very good for agriculture. The vast rivers, particularly the Tiber River, flowed 250 miles from areas such as Rome and went up into the Alps. So you had a place where you could center trade going up and down the river. And the climate itself stays quite mild throughout the entire year. Plus, as a side note, the Mediterranean Sea in this area is absolutely magically beautiful. A stunning blue that I have never seen in another body of water ever. So it contains a bit of a magic to it. So if you have the Alps protect you from outside forces. You have really good territory to grow crops. So if you choose, you can stay here within your territory, grow some crops, grow some cities, and this is all nice. Or once you have these sort of bases for civilization, one can choose to expand out and try to conquer the entirety of the Mediterranean world, which is exactly what the Roman people will do. So within our lecture, we're going to study approximately 750 BCE up until around the year 63 BC, taking it a few steps further to try to understand the original origins of Rome, the regal era, the era of the Republic, and what transformed the Republic into an empire. And we'll see one of the most important defining factors of the Roman experience will be the Greeks. One of the main reasons being is that before Rome really fully developed itself as a society, in the southern areas of the Italian peninsula, Greeks had come through and turned these into Greek colonies. So the peoples in the southern parts of the Italian peninsula, they spoke Greek language, they had elements of Greek mythology, they were ruled over by Greek political structures, and the Romans looked at this, they borrowed elements of the language, creating a Latin-based language, and they started stealing all of their gods, which you can see in our little chart in the upper right-hand corner, is they said, oh, the Greek god of Zeus. Well, the Greeks, they have the story right, but they have the name wrong. Zeus is Jupiter. Hera, her real name is Juno. Poseidon, well, that's Neptune. You'll see many of these names with the Romans we associate in modern times with planetary names. These names will have a long-lasting legacy, but particular, one of the most vital parts to understand is the Greek god of Ares, or the Roman concept, the Greek god of Mars, the god of war. The god of war will define the Roman experience because the Romans' goal will be to go forward and to be a warlike people and to conquer the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea. So what is Rome, and how did Rome become such a huge empire? Initially, Rome started off as this little itty-bitty city here. It got to be the largest city of the ancient world, outside of Chinese cities, but this isn't world history. This is Western civilization. So how did the Romans come to define Western civilization? Well, first they came to the south and they took out some Greeks here. Then they went to the north and they took out some other peoples that were fellow Latin-speaking peoples, and they said, hey, you want to be Romans too? And they said, sure. Do we join the military? And they're like, yeah, join the military and pay your taxes and call our leader your leader. And they said, okay. And then they started going over here and said, oh, we stole the ideas of the Greeks. Why not steal the land of the Greeks? Well, that's good. Heck, let's go further. Let's steal some more Greek land. Okay, well, that's nice. But we want to make sure that our back door is secure, so let's steal all this land over here. But that land belongs to people down here, so let's go ahead and conquer down here. Then we'll take all of here. And heck, now we've taken there, let's hop down here. Let's take this place. Oh my goodness. And like, ooh, end of the Republic, let's just take Egypt. And we will take everything. We will call the Mediterranean Sea ours, and we will help to define what it means to be Europe. Quite literally. So, how is it that a small city will grow out to be one of the largest empires and one of the most powerful empires humanity has ever known? So if we're going to understand something about any ancient civilization, we need to look at some of the stories and the myths that help to create and to give a unique identity to that civilization. So first we need to look at the writings of the Roman writer Virgil and his classic piece called the Aeneid. The Aeneid looks at elements of the Trojan Wars. Troy was a Greek city built on the coast in what we would now call Turkey, technically a part of the Middle East. During the Trojan Wars, the city of Troy was burnt to the ground and destroyed, and according to Virgil, a man named Aeneas fled with a number of other Trojans, hopped on boats, went across the Mediterranean Sea, and ended up landing and discovering an area that would later on be called Rome. What helped to found Rome, according to the Romans, was an interaction of the gods, the one true god of war, Mars, not Ares, although they're the same, just different names, according to the Romans. The Roman god of war, Mars, had sexual encounters with a mortal mother, and the mother gave birth to two twin sons, Remus and Romulus. But, as is common in many stories of the ancient past, is that these sons were cast away into a river and then were found. But what is different with the Roman story is they weren't found by a human, they were found by a wolf. When you think about a wolf is an animal source of danger and fear, because wolves can be highly vicious. Wolves are something to be frightened of. If you believe that the founders of your civilization were the sons of the god of war who were raised by a wolf, because wolves can mess shit up real quick. That's a powerhouse story to start with, particularly if one of the twins kills the other one. So, Remus and Romulus, they have built up a small village. They start building walls around their village. They start having an argument about what the nature of this should be, and Romulus kills his brother Remus. And the city then will take on the name of Romulus and be called Rome, a very unique city founded upon 7 different hills. Keep that number 7 in mind, because when we start talking about the importance of numbers and the birth of a religion called Christianity, the number 7 is going to be highly important on a number of different levels. So where we can start tracing elements of Roman history is the Romans said after the city was built, is that then a new monarchy was born in the city to rule over the peoples of this land, and the peoples that they ruled over were split into two different social classes. The plebeians, who were your basic farmers. These were people who did not have the right to own land, and when it came down to warfare, they were the ones who were the soldiers who walked to fight the wars. And then the other 2% of all society, called the patricians. These were the wealthy land-owning aristocrats. These were the ones who had the ability to participate in all things in government and to rule over the other 98% of everyone else, the plebs, the plebeians. and to tell them that they had to grow them food, and to tell them they had to go to war. And they had a very specific structure to enforce these ideas. First and foremost, this was known as the regal age, which means you have a monarch in charge, so the Romans had a king. That king was somebody who was not necessarily put in place by a birthright, but was appointed and approved by a political structure called the Senate. The Senate was composed of 100 people from the ruling classes of the land. That might sound very similar because how many senators does the US government have? 100. And up until just before the outbreak of World War I, who elected senators? Not the American people. It was not an institution that had democratic election. It was the people who were the elites. It was something modeled upon the British idea of the House of Lords. And here is where the Romans and the House of Lords have a unique connection, which our Senate does not have. As they said, in order to be a senator, one had to be a person of virtue who could put the public good over all things, which meant one could not be involved with trade and with business. They said the whole point of government is to hold a society together primarily by negotiating and dictating elements of rules over private trade and business. They said that would be a conflict of interest. If you're a person who is involved in business, if you're a business person, you can't be a politician because you would probably use the powers of government for your own business goods. So, based upon this, the Senate would elect somebody to be king. That king would be in charge until they passed away. Then the Senate would pick another king, and oftentimes that king would be from the same family, but the Senate also had a veto power saying, we think your son is kind of a lunatic. Let's not allow him to be in power, which is what is going to bring an end to the regal age of Rome. According to Roman mythology, there is a great patriotic story of Romans coming together to overthrow oppression and tyranny because the son of the king had gone off to visit another very prominent family, and there was a woman who lived in that household named Lucretia, who was married, and that the son of the king raped Lucretia and threatened Lucretia with all sorts of horrible embarrassments and blackmail and all sorts of things if she ever told anyone about it. So after this event occurred, Lucretia went forward to her father, admitted what had happened, and based upon her own aspect of guilt as a victim, blame the victim much Western civilization, is she stabbed herself to death. And when Romans heard about this, they're like, oh my god, like this guy is going to be next up to be king. Hell with this stuff. Let's get rid of the king. Let's be a republic. Because that is the difference between a monarchy. A monarchy is a nation that has a king or a queen in charge, or an emperor. The difference with a republic is you simply change that ruler and you put in a different ruler. You don't necessarily have to democratically elect them, but you don't call them a king. So welcome to the birth of the republic. Is the king will be overthrown, the republic will be put in place, and there will be hundreds of years of legacies of trying to protect the republic to make sure that Rome did not revert back into any element of a monarchy. And once Rome became a republic, it will only take just a couple of hundred years for people to start recognizing that there was something unique about the Roman experience and that Rome would soon be a rising power not just of the ancient world, but a rising power coming from the European continent, trying to define new elements of what it means to be a major power, and particularly a European power. Now, any nation that aspires to any type of grandeur or power will always have a common narrative where people try to say these are the specific unique values of our own civilization and of our own political structures that we embody, and this is why, because of unique things, that we aspire to be a dominant power within the world. So for the fact that the Roman Republic was born out of a rejection of the rape of Lucretia, is that Romans like to put forward the idea that what it meant to be part of the Roman experience is one always stood for virtue and the larger social good. And that the republic that was created by the Romans systematically put features in place to always be able to protect the larger common social good. So the executive branch, instead of just trusting power to a one king, is they created an executive branch made up of two different councils. These councils would have to consult with each other on different ideas. They would be elected directly from the Senate, and so it's not the common people who are voting for them. And these particular councils had the ability, if necessary, to seize all government power during a period of crisis, to use all of the power of government to facilitate a larger social good in the name of virtue. There were 15 different virtues that Roman senators said that they had to abide by. Ideas about humanity, liberty, nobility, a certain firmness about oneself. But along with these things, these could manifest into something else. So one of the great stories about the Romans that carried on to American times, as well as in the 20th century in a slightly different form, was the story of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, who had gone off, and he had once held great power in Rome. He went off, he was working on his farm, but within Rome there was a threat of a larger internal rebellion of common people, and that Cincinnatus put away his plow, picked up his sword, and he led the Roman people to victory to crush out this rebellion. And the symbol of authority that Cincinnatus used is what was called the fasces. This is where you took an axe and you made the axe stronger by bundling all around it different rods of wood that represented elements of social unity. You bind them together with leather straps to make them even tighter, and that the axe can bring about retribution and swift punishment in the name of a larger social purpose. In the 20th century, that is what we call fascism, a movement born in Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini at the end of World War I. It was a larger movement about bringing about social unity to crush out rebellions, either in 1919 with the Italian case or in 458 BCE with the initial Roman case. But where this ties in with American history was that Cincinnatus was given supreme dictatorial powers over all branches of government to lead the military to crush this rebellion. And when he had been given this ultimate power, once he had protected the social good, as he stepped away from power, and he went back to farming. The idea of what we say, turning our swords into plowshares, a concept popularized within the Christian Holy Bible, but also popularized within the narrative of the United States with our first president, George Washington. So what we're seeing is some of the early days of the American experience, as well as other European dictatorial powers being born in the Roman experience. We're going to have a legislative branch that is made up of two different branches. Each one of these branches represents certain elements of different social classes. And we have a judicial branch where we have elected different judges, and these judges are going to base Roman law not based upon the old concept of Hammurabi's Code, or an eye for an eye, but what they call the 12 tables. These 12 tables lay out the basic aspects about how Roman law applies to all citizens of Rome, regardless of social class. It is up to the judicial branch to treat individuals fairly based upon this common law that is there for all people. Now, for the first 20 years of the regal age, the plebeians, the common people, the 98%, were given absolutely no voice in government. So what the plebeians did in the year 494 BC, according to Roman legend, is they declared what they called a general strike, where all the workers of the city of Rome simply said, you know what, brand new government, to hell with this. You didn't give us any say in government. So we're all leaving. Good luck to you, rich people. Enjoy ruling over nobody, because we're not coming back and going to work until you give us some say in government. And what the patrician class is going to give as a compromise to the plebeians, and it's one of the most powerful concepts of Rome, is in modern times we call this ideas of checks and balances, or perhaps one could say the ability to impeach, to remove somebody from power. The plebeians are something different. Plebeians are given the right to create what is called the plebeian tribune, where they will have 3 people representing the plebeian class. Those plebeian tribune will be part of the meetings of the larger Roman Senate. And if they feel that any senator, particularly if there's somebody who might try and engage in business, is not standing up for all the 15 great virtues of the Roman people and standing up for the public good is that poor people have the right to kill off rich politicians. Now that's a system of checks and balances, which it meant that for the most part, wealthy people in Rome kept themselves in line and did not use the powers of government for their own personal purposes. So, what Roman life came to be about was a concept of, I'd say, a strength within a certain element of a unified culture. There's always been this saying ever since the early times of Rome that was used at the time and still used in modern day. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Because Rome had a very, very unique culture compared to other cities of the ancient world. And according to most Roman accounts, work life in Rome was usually only about a 6-hour day. And when people got done with their 6-hour day of work, is they engaged in larger public activities, particularly games, sporting events, going to the Colosseum to watch battles. And there was a highly active merchant culture. There would be shops where you could go purchase all sorts of things, but right there with the shop, there'd be taverns, there'd be wine bars. As people would come to Rome with their goods, they would get rip-roaring drunk, they would talk around ideas, they would see gladiators going at each other, and people would say, whoa, the Romans, my goodness, these people only work 6 hours a day, and they get drunk, and they watch people kill each other for fun and sports and entertainment. Well, hell, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So while Greek society will be based upon elements of militarism and slavery, so will Roman society, but in some slightly different and very unique ways. Greek militarism was based upon a concept of building up strength to protect oneself from the Persians. It wasn't necessarily built up as an invincible force to go out for conquering. It's just that that's what Alexander decided to do with it. The Romans will be very different. Their unique brand of militarism is based first and foremost upon the idea of the draft. If one lives within elements of Roman territory and one is a male, one is subject to be forced into participation within the military. But if you are forced into participation, how do you keep any sense of discipline? You need both a carrot and a stick. The carrot will provide something positive. The stick is we can instill a level of discipline that had never been known within the militaries of the ancient world. So the carrot we're going to provide is what we call a plunder economy. We force people into military service, but as they're going forth and conquering people, yeah, go ahead, steal their stuff. It's cool. And we'll give you some stuff for stealing stuff because that's how we're going to make our wealth, is going around and conquering and stealing stuff and enslaving people for a while. But boy, oh boy, if you've got questions about that, or if you're going in forward into a massive battle, and there's some stories about the initial battles the Romans had with Carthage, Roman generals sending in troops as essentially cannon fodder, 50,000 troops wiped out in one battle. What? How do you keep discipline in a scenario like that? It is the horrible tradition which still carries on. Decimation. So if somebody has disobeyed orders, when the battle is done, you line soldiers up, you have them count off 1 through 10, and the 10th soldier has to step out, and each of the 10th soldiers is immediately executed in front of their fellow soldier. So, if you're a person who is in battle and you see somebody else who is not pushing forward when they're told to push forward, is you as a soldier, you push them forward because you don't want to be part of the lineup afterwards and hypothetically be the one counted number 10. So we have the Romans, we keep military discipline by threatening to kill our own soldiers. And that technique will carry on for thousands of years after that. But here's the great question. As soldiers start building up and they have these armor, they have their metal armor, they have their shields, they have all sorts of different weaponry. They're a highly, highly dangerous fighting force. People will refer to as legionnaires. Is their loyalty to the Roman government or to the general they are serving under? And that's going to always cause some huge problems. What will cause even greater problems towards the end of Rome is, in order to keep building up their military, is when they conquer people, they will give soldiers an option. Either A, we can make you a slave for a while, or B, you're really good at military. How would you two like to be a Roman soldier. Even though you were just fighting Roman soldiers, we'll make you a Roman soldier because you're really good at killing people. Now, if you keep doing that with too many foreign peoples who have no loyalty to the government, you might end up with some trouble if there are too many Germanic tribes who are trained in Roman military techniques. Now, the problem with the slave economy of Rome is that every time the Romans conquer somebody, is they'll take huge numbers of people into slavery. About 1/3 of all of Roman society, and is a truism throughout the period of the Republic as well as the Empire, will be slaves. Now, within Roman society, these slaves are utilized for a variety of different purposes. Some will be domestic servants. Some will be farmers. Some, if you come from a military background, will be entertainment. You'll be gladiators, slave soldiers fighting each other to the death for public entertainment, the tradition of blood sports, or for the fact that Rome is going to make so many things out of very heavy stone, is to take you and to work you to death in the mines, to mine stone for the Romans to build things, or as Roman aspects of infrastructure go forward, of the Romans' ability to build tunnels through mountains. You don't want Romans dying in that process, so you bring in slaves. Now, the problem is, if you start bringing in too many slaves, it is the first thing. Anytime a soldier is sent off to fight in a war, the first thing they want when they return back and they're a veteran is they want life to get back to normal. They want land and they want a job. Now, if they come back, if one of the aspects that comes about is every time they go to war is it brings more slaves in, is they're going to find one of the great challenges is the constant threats of slave uprisings as well as soldier uprisings, because when soldiers come back and their jobs have been taken by slaves, well, they start to question the system. When slaves are here and they're being utilized and brutalized, you have situations such as the Spartacus uprising, where Spartacus led a whole group of slaves to try to challenge and overthrow the system, and eventually the Romans having to come together to crush out these slave rebellions. But due to the fact that the Romans were used to using completely brutal techniques when it came to their military, and that they oftentimes enslaved other peoples and brutalized others, is for cultures outside of Rome, is that they were pretty much universally despised throughout the ancient world. They were feared, they were hated. And one of the groups who will consistently stand up to the Romans and be a complete thorn in their side are the Celtic people. We'll introduce them today, and we'll talk about them more in our next lecture with elements of the empire. Is that in the northern parts of what we would call the British Isles, where you have England, and then to the north of that where you have what is called Scotland, is there's going to be a wall built by the Romans there called Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall is not to keep Celts out, it is a sign to Roman soldiers as they're traveling forward. If they come across this wall, do not cross this wall, because when you cross there are Celtic peoples, the Picts, the Celtic tribes, people will later on be known as the Scots, people who will go out fighting against you, not wearing any armor or clothing, completely naked, wearing blue war paint. And when they do start putting on clothes, the Scottish men, they put on a thing called a kilt. It's a man's dress. It's a warrior's outfit. The Romans are scared to death of the Celts, for good reason, because the Celts will never surrender, and the Celts will always fight, because coercion and violence are absolutely essential to how Rome practices many parts of their own government and social system, particularly as they expand in further conquest. So to understand something about how foreigners perceive the Romans, if we look at a quick quote from a primary document from Chief Galgacus of Caledonia, he was one of the Celtic chieftains leading together peoples later on to be known as the Scottish peoples in resistance against the Romans. The chief stating, quote, "You find in the Romans an arrogance which no reasonable submission can elude. Brigands of the world, they have exhausted the land by their indiscriminate plunder, and now they ransack the sea. The wealth of an enemy excites their cupidity, his poverty, their lust of power. Robbery, butchery, rapine, the liars create a desolation and then dare to call it peace. Our loved ones are now being torn from us by conscription to slave in other lands. Our wives and sisters are raped by their enemy's soldiers. Our goods and money are consumed by taxation. Our land is stripped of its harvest to fill their granaries. Our hands and limbs are crippled by building roads through forests and swamps under the lash of our oppressors. So according to the Scottish perception of the Romans will say, we are standing for peace, we stand for progress. They'll say, you stand for destruction, mayhem, murder, rape, and absolute butchery of foreign peoples because you are arrogant. You always have been, and you always will be. So just a slight snapshot of how others perceive the Romans, not of how the Romans perceive themselves. So one of the reasons why the Romans will have such a lasting legacy in defining Western civilization has to do with elements of how they advanced elements of infrastructure as well as governance. Because much of the infrastructure that the Romans laid in areas throughout Europe, you can still find remnants of these things to this day, and particularly when it comes down to elements of the roadways. The Romans are going to build close to 500,000 miles of roads. Of those 500,000 miles of roads, about 50,000 of them are going to be paved. And the modern road system of Europe is still almost exclusively based upon the old road systems that the Romans put in place. So the Romans, when they build up roads, when they build a thing called aqueducts, instead of having to have your city right next to a river, as an aqueduct could flow water into the city through piping, and then that city could then evolve of having a consistent source of water. So it's not just that the Romans built cities, Romans laid a specific style of infrastructure where you could have what I would call advanced cities. Because advanced cities, once you have consistent access to water that's being piped in, you can start regulating the use of that water, and you can work on elements of public health and sanitation. So the Romans will be famous for building huge, glorious bathhouses, much in the same tradition as the Greeks once had, except that the Roman bathhouses will be made up and corresponded of huge, ornate structures. There will be artwork everywhere. There will be statues. There will be areas with heated water where people can come, they can socialize, they can gather together in water, and particularly a lot of naked men participating in, one could say, extramarital activity. I will let you figure that out. One of the other elements is it's not just the Romans can build up aspects of your bathhouses and things, but if they were building up a port city, is the Romans are going to start perfecting a new building method with a building material called concrete. They're able to put together molds. You can pour concrete into the mold, let it set, remove the mold, and you have a structure that for many of them are still standing to this day. So when they're building up port cities, they can build up piers and docks that go much further out into the water by building these huge ornate concrete slabs that go down into the water, these huge rods that will help to hold the piers and the docks up. Along with this, they're going to be perfectionists in building elements of arches. With arches, you can build magnificent elements of architecture that are much better standing, and you can also build things such as bridges. Now, the Romans building up this infrastructure for you is going to come at an element of a cost. If you are conquered over by the Roman government, you have to declare complete obedience to the Roman leader, or as we'll see later on, the Roman emperor. You have to consistently pay your taxes. If you are not willing to abide by these basic elements of what Rome declares, if you attempt to subvert Roman power or challenge it in any way, shape, or form, there will be swift retribution. Your peoples will be enslaved. Your things that you treasure, such as if you are the Jewish people, things such as your temple, will be destroyed. Your leaders will be executed through a unique Roman form of execution called crucifixion. We'll put your leaders up on crosses if they are telling a social message that goes against the grain of Roman values of violence, obedience, and oppression. We'll explore that more under the Roman Empire. What will be unique with the Romans, though, when they start to expand out, is they're building up a new concept of what it means to be European by focusing on rule over the Mediterranean and not trying to conquer areas in the Middle East. They'll conquer far enough into the Middle East to create a buffer zone for their control of the Mediterranean. They will focus in on being a strong neighbor against potential Middle East rivals, particularly the Persians, but they're going to focus in their power upon elements of southern Europe, of northern Africa, and to rule over the entirety of the Mediterranean, which means they'll bring forth brand new dynamics of how power works and where the true center of power is, no longer in the Middle East, but along the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea. So the real power interest of Rome, since it lay with the Mediterranean Sea, and not with a conquering of the Middle East and all of the necessarily the Hellenistic kingdoms, is what Rome did first was focus in upon trying to protect its backside by attacking to the west, and then once controlling the west, started going east to take over the former Hellenistic kingdoms. So, once the Romans, during the first 200 years of the Republic, had secured the entirety of the Italian peninsula, their first mode of attack was to knock out their main potential competitor in the Mediterranean Sea, the North African Empire of Carthage. What the Romans are going to do is first they take out a few different islands in the Mediterranean that Carthage controlled, places such as Sicily, we now associate as being part of Italy, and then they're going to attempt to attack right in the heart of the capital of Carthage. Carthage, in return, in the year 216 BCE, is going to send one of the greatest generals of all time. General Hannibal is going to take a force of 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 40 elephants, and to march across the entirety of Spain, to march up across the Pyrenees Mountains, go into the Alps, cross the Alps on friggin' elephants, and drive straight to the capital city of Rome. And Hannibal decimated Rome, and Hannibal's forces for the next 12 years kept conquering different areas of the southern parts of Italy, but the problem is then they were sort of cut off from reinforcements coming, and the Romans played a war of attrition with Carthage, and eventually were able to succeed and to come in control of the entirety of the Western Mediterranean. Once they had this secured, is they started attacking to the east. What they did was they put out a Greek style of a call, as they said the Greek people were being oppressed by the evil Macedonians, and therefore the Romans were coming to liberate the Greeks from the evil Macedonians, and they used this to launch an invasion. And then anyone who was trying to assist against the Roman occupation, as they said, oh, you're plotting with the evil Macedonians. They're stealing the line the Macedonians used about the Persians. And over the next 100 years, they're going to take out the entirety of what had been the Macedonian kingdom, starting to move south into areas of the Middle East, marching troops all the way up to the Euphrates River, taking over areas that we now call Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, which means now they're encircling more of the Mediterranean, but they also want to make sure that their northern borders are protected. So the most dire enemies in the ancient era against the Romans are going to be the Celtic peoples. Usually associate the Celts as being peoples of Ireland, Scotland, Wales. The Celts originated, though, on the European continent and over time started immigrating across what we now call the English Channel into areas that we call the British Isles. But the original stronghold of the Celts were in areas we now know as Spain, France, and Belgium. A very particular tribe of the Celts called the Gauls. So, the Romans will lead attacks against the Gallic Celts within France. And the one who leads these attacks, the Roman general and soon-to-be dictator, Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar claims that he killed almost 1.5 million Celts in these battles. He also claimed that he captured and enslaved almost 1 million Celts and brought them back to Rome to be servants to the Romans. And that this wasn't enough, that he was going to go further. He would cross the English Channel and he would get a hold of the rampant Celts who were now part of the British Isles, and that he led a force to go down a river called the Thames. And when the Thames came to a certain area of a loop, is that Roman forces stopped, they got off their boats, and they started building military bases. And they called this new Roman capital in the British Isles London, which is still the official capital of both England as well as the United Kingdom of Great Britain. What the Romans did then is they had a very specific strategy of conquering based upon a bigger picture, since they don't want the Middle East, but they don't want opponents in Europe or in Northern Africa. Is first they defeated their potential opponents there within the West, then they displaced the Greeks in the East. They'll use that as a provocation to then also encircle and come in and take the rest of the Mediterranean with Egypt, and to define themselves now as the dominant power of what we call Europe and Northern Africa. Now, one of the great challenges for any civilization as it goes out and spreads its influence throughout the world is when it comes down to elements of disparities and discrepancies in wealth accumulation. The Roman Republic had already started out with the patrician and the plebeian class, where you had 2% ruling over the other 98%. But as time went on with the expansion of Rome, there was so much wealth being stolen from around and so many slaves coming in that the wealthy were getting super wealthy, and that the veterans, when they would come back, they would find themselves being evicted from land. The former jobs they had, they were being replaced by slaves, and they said, I put my life on the line for Rome, and what do I get when I come back is suffering. And there were Roman leaders who tried to warn about this. And those Roman leaders, we will see, are going to face some problems. A little problem called assassination. So when the Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, put forward new ideas about the accumulation of land and talked about land redistribution to veterans who had just come back from the war, is both these men were assassinated. And the poor and the oppressed, who had seen these men as their great liberators, standing for virtue, as they rose up and started becoming independent mercenaries and said, my tribute and allegiance is not to Rome. We tried to use the power of Rome. You killed off our heroes. Now, general, lead us to powers. And I, as a soldier, I swear my allegiance to you. But first, you have to be able to flex power to pay me as your soldier. So let's march on the capital city of Rome. And for about 60 years, the Romans, just after they expanded their power, they turned into a constant state of civil war. Because generals would come in, they would lead their troops in, they would seize temporary power for the social good, call themselves a dictator, and then they would be pushed out by another general, or they'd be assassinated. And then another general came in, named Julius Caesar. For a period of about 15 years, Julius Caesar is going to redefine elements of the Roman world. He is powerful and mighty. He was willing to utilize techniques of genocide. And I don't mean genocide with a small g, old school, ancient style. I mean when he's fighting against the Celts. When you've killed over 1 million people in the name of a nation state, that qualifies as genocide. He enslaved those people. But according to Romans, he was also quite charismatic and charming, and highly popular amongst the Roman people. What Julius Caesar is going to do is, after one of his campaigns against the Gauls, is that there was a tradition within Rome that if one was a general, one was not allowed to march into Italian territory with your armies mobilized. What Julius Caesar is going to do is he is going to march his troops into Italy, fully mobilized. He's going to march the capital city of Rome. There, a fellow Roman leader, Pompey, is going to attempt to confront him, and then Pompey flees and goes off to the Greek region of Egypt, where he tries to conspire against Greek power there, and he tries to conspire against the power of one of the last Greek pharaoh-esque leaders, Cleopatra. And Julius Caesar is going to cross over into Egypt. He is going to try to track Pompey down. He is going to burn the library at Alexandria. And then he is going to hook up an alliance with Cleopatra. The two of them become lovers. The area of Egypt starts coming under Roman dominion, now meaning the Romans have encircled the entirety of the Mediterranean. And Pompey takes his own life, which is a very powerful symbol because Pompey had been known as one of the most powerful generals in all of Roman history. So, when Julius Caesar returned from his campaigns in Egypt, is he made the statement, because the dictatorship, if one was going to become a dictator for a period, it was usually only about 6 months, then one had to step down and to release power. Julius Caesar says for the greater good of the public. And reminder, I've got a lot of loyal soldiers right there behind me. I'm heavily armed. As he said, I'm going to be dictator for life. And welcome to the events, as told to us by William Shakespeare, with the Ides of March. When Julius Caesar, on the floor of the Roman Senate, is going to be stabbed 23 times. One of the associates involved in the stabbing, Julius Caesar's good friend Brutus. The assassins, they said that they killed Caesar to try to save the Republic. Now the problem with that is Julius Caesar is going to hand down power and all of his wealth to his grandnephew, Octavian, and say that Octavian is the rightful heir of any power from him, the rightful ruler of all of his soldiers. And Octavian is going to say that these conspirators who killed Julius Caesar, they did this to undermine the power of Rome. And these conspirators fled off to areas within the former Greek empires. And Octavian says, I will track you down. I will defeat you all. And in this process, Octavian alienated some other Roman leaders, such as Mark Antony. Mark Antony had fled Rome. He had gone to Egypt. He also fell for Cleopatra, trying to get a love engagement going there. And Octavian is going to go to Egypt, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra kill themselves. And Octavian declares all of Egypt now to be part of the Roman Empire. And when he comes back, he says the time of the Republic has come to an end, and he declares himself Augustus Caesar, which means he is now the emperor of the Roman people. But he says his rule will bring a unique period. It's referred to as the period of the Pax Romana, the era of the Roman peace. He said an emperor stepping in was something completely necessary to bring an end to the constant instability of the Republic and to protect the true values of the Republic. That's going to be highly important because if you go on with other history classes, you'll see others attempt to repeat this exact same narrative. Napoleon Bonaparte overthrowing the French Republic, declaring himself emperor, blah, blah, blah. That's for another story. But we've gone through a ton of stuff. What are the long-lasting legacies of the Roman Republic era? So while it is the Greeks who started the concept of Western civilization, it will be the Romans who start solidifying this more and more, of saying that Western civilization is not about stretching into the Middle East. Western civilization is about controlling the Mediterranean Sea. They will try to shift global power over to Europe, to areas in Northern Africa. They will distinguish that Northern Africa is a different type of people, and that those areas are colonies ruled over by Europeans on the north of the Mediterranean Sea. But along with this, included within the territory of the Western Dominion, will be the territory we now know of as Israel, and that the Romans will claim that such cities, such as Jerusalem, are connected with Western civilization, not with the Middle East and Eastern civilization. But they're also going to bring up some new trends about how empire works. They're not going to do this sort of touchy-feely Persian stuff, just pay your taxes and everything's going to be fine, nothing changes. They said, no, you are now part of Rome. You will follow Roman law. You will follow Roman traditions, customs, and you will accept our rule. You will pay our taxes, because the first thing we do is we overwhelm our potential enemies through acts of violence, through acts of terror. And once we have shown them how powerful we are, is we subdue any potential rebellious forces by being more inclusive into the Roman experience, providing roads, providing aqueducts. But what's important in building up this infrastructure of stability is that they're engineering two different things. In engineering a physical infrastructure, they're engineering a political infrastructure as well. Because when you have the ability to provide advanced cities through high quality roads, through bringing water in, is people take a great pride in these highly advanced cities. And people who would perhaps originally live there might want to have rule over their own cities after they'd already been developed by the Romans, which is where the roads come in. because the roads provide a quick movement of products, so people are getting access to trade and things, but also you can very quickly move troops across these roads. And it's important to understand is that troop movements and keeping these roads up will be absolutely vital. And once a government has built up infrastructure, to keep this infrastructure going forward is you need revenue, you need taxes. And we'll see over our next couple of lectures, some huge crises will start happening within Roman civilization when people no longer want to pay taxes into the system, when politicians start talking about things such as tax cuts, but they also don't have money to pay for the upkeep of infrastructure. What will happen to Rome when those roads that they built to be able to send troops out, if they start falling apart, and if troops from the outside, perhaps Germanic tribes, can start moving in? But that will be next week. I hope you've enjoyed our short lecture upon Rome. Take care, and I will see you next week for the Roman Empire.